5 jaar geleden lijfde Irak buurland Koeweit in als 19e provincie. De grootste oorlogsmachine sinds de Tweede Wereldoorlog werd vervolgens in gang gezet. Aanvankelijk vanuit de lucht en tenslotte ook op het land. De Britse documentaire The Gulf War vormde de basis voor de 3e VPRO-themaavond van dit seizoen. 3 uur lang interviews met kopstukken, eigen opnamen van militairen en particulieren en archiefbeelden die indertijd achtergehouden zijn. Uw aandacht voor de Golfoorlog.
Five years ago, amid the burning oil wells of Kuwait, 2 armies faced each other on the edge of battle. At stake, the oil fields of the Middle East. It was a war whose weaponry would give a glimpse of how men will fight in the 21st century. A war which would allow America to banish the ghosts of Vietnam and rediscover confidence in its military might. A war which would curb an aggressive dictator with nuclear ambitions. And a war which would do much to shape the world we live in. This is its story. Eight weeks before plunging the Middle East into war, Saddam Hussein welcomed his neighbor, the Emir of Kuwait. The Emir ruled one of the richest countries on earth. Kuwait had less than 1 million citizens, but 1/10 of the world's oil. Saddam was a dictator with ambitions. For 8 years, he fought Iran. Now, 2 years on, he was using Iraq's huge oil revenues to develop nuclear weapons and equip a 1 million-strong army. He wanted to challenge Israel and dominate the Middle East. But the British and American governments thought he was a dictator they could do business with.
We had thought this man has fought a war against Iran for 8 years. During those 8 years, something like 500,000 young people have been killed. 500,000 on both sides. Surely after that, he can't go and have another military operation.
The idea that on a Sunday afternoon or something, I was going to stroll into the Oval and go, oh, by the way, Mr. President, Saddam Hussein is going to mass 100,000 plus forces and is going to walk into Kuwait and is going to make this the 19th province of Iraq. And this is going to be the major test of the post-Cold War world. That was too big. It was too dramatic.
But that day in May 1990, Saddam was fighting to survive. His military ambitions meant Iraq was living beyond its means. The price of oil was plummeting. The country would be bankrupt in 3 months. Saddam blamed the Emir. The Emir was flooding the market with cheap oil. Cheap oil meant bigger profits for the thousands of companies Kuwait owned in the West. Later, when the day's business was over, Saddam summoned the Arab leaders to a private meeting. When the cameras left, he warned the Emir to stop pushing down the price of oil.
He said each dollar less in price means to us 1 billion in revenues for a year. If you do not mean waging a war against Iraq, please stop it.
As economic collapse approached, Saddam used vast rallies to whip up opinion against Kuwait. But the emir took a tough stand. Saddam and his inner circle scented a conspiracy to crush their regime before they could challenge Israel.
By the end of June, we started to realize that there is a conspiracy against Iraq, a deliberate conspiracy against Iraq by Kuwait, organized, devised by the United States.
I could not foresee a military invasion of Kuwait, but things had gotten to a point where I felt that there was real danger of something totally disastrous happening in the region.
Saddam summoned the key men in his regime. They decided unless Kuwait handed over $10 billion immediately, Iraq would invade.
It was quite clear to everybody. Iraq had no choice but to act, either to be destroyed, to be suffocated and strangled inside its territory, or attack the enemy on the outside. That was the calculation, and I think it was a correct one.
Saddam ordered the Republican Guard to move south towards Iraq's border with Kuwait. These were the Iraqi army's elite divisions. Equipped with modern Soviet tanks, no other Middle Eastern country except Israel had forces to rival them. Soon, on the border between Iraq and Kuwait, 30,000 Iraqi troops had massed. A traveling British diplomat saw them and told American military intelligence.
Our first indication came from a human intelligence source, a very reliable one, who identified 3 Republican Guard divisions moving south toward Kuwait.
In Washington, America's most senior soldier was soon inspecting pictures from a spy satellite and trying to piece together the Iraqi plan.
Over the next few days, over a relatively short period of time, more and more information came forward that started to put these pieces in place. Artillery was coming forward. Logistics units were being seen. Signals networks were coming up, to the point that finally it could not be ignored, and I called General Schwarzkopf and said, "Norm, are you looking at what I'm looking at?" And he says, "Yes."
It was only when we started to see this pattern of the type of forces that you would need to conduct an operation being grouped together geographically on the ground that it became very apparent that what you were seeing emerging was a military plan.
The news was passed to George Bush, then in his second year as president. Satellite pictures couldn't tell him what Saddam intended, but the president and his national security advisor, Brent Scowcroft, knew vital interests were at stake.
The notion of Iraq, which was an oil powerhouse in itself, acquiring the Kuwaiti resources, and thus perhaps being able to dominate OPEC, was a tremendous danger.
Help was at hand. With the crisis building, one of America's closest allies in the Middle East had rushed to Baghdad. Once again, the band played and the red carpet was rolled out. The president of Egypt, Hosni Mubarak, had been sent by the Arab world to discover Saddam's plans. It was an encounter that would have far-reaching consequences.
I met with Saddam Hussein. He met me in the airport. Then he took me in the car. He was driving, beside him, nobody with us, until we went to one of the palaces near the lake there. And we went upstairs to the first floor, tete-a-tete, in a big room, and we were both alone, nobody with us. I asked him about what's the problem, what's happening. I told him, "Do you have any intention to attack them, invade them?" He told me, "No, but don't tell the Kuwaitis about that." It was a very clear answer.
As soon as he left Iraq, the Egyptian president telephoned the White House with the news that Saddam was bluffing. Mubarak told George Bush that the Iraqi leader was desperate for money, but the Arabs could sort things out. Brent Scowcroft remembers the call coming in.
There was some urgency to his call, and what he was really saying is, you know, don't jump in this thing. Just let it work its way out. You got to handle this guy right.
So while we were worrying about it and starting to make military plans, in the political diplomatic world, we were being told not to worry about it.
President Mubarak flew on to Kuwait. The emir was desperate for news. As soon as the two leaders were alone, the emir began to describe the pressure he was under.
He told me that Saddam Hussein asked me to give him $10 billion cash. He told me I cannot bring 10 billion cash now. Anyway, I told him what happened between me and Saddam. And even I told him there is no intention to attack Kuwait, as Saddam said. But he told me, don't tell him. But I told him because they were terrified.
When we made general offers to the Kuwaitis of military support, their response was, stay away from us. We can handle this. We can handle this together with our Arab brothers. The most we'll have to deal with is problems at the Arab League. We'll negotiate this. Don't take actions that will provoke the Iraqis to do what we fear they might do.
The next day, Saddam Hussein summoned the American ambassador. April Glaspie told the Iraqis nothing to make them change their calculations. She reiterated to Saddam that he would not excuse the use of force, but she had no authority to go further.
The idea that April Glaspie, with no instructions to do so, could have told Saddam Hussein, you send one tank across that border and my president will send 500,000 U.S. men and women and kick your butt back across into Iraq, she would have been laughed out of the room.
As the meeting ended, Saddam announced there would be talks with the Kuwaitis.
The president wanted to send a message to George Bush that we are not the enemies of the United States. We do not intend to threaten the interest of the United States. We do not intend to threaten our neighbors. There was a crisis with Kuwait, and we hoped and we really wanted to solve it peacefully.
Glaspie cabled Washington, Saddam is worried. We would be well advised to ease off on public criticism until we see how negotiations develop. The cable reached the president's Middle East advisor at a critical moment.
I had actually written a memo to the president saying, we're getting all this intelligence, obviously concerned, when suddenly the cable from April Glaspie came. And what I did was I scribbled on the top of the memo, what I've written you may be a little bit OBE, overtaken by events, Mr. President, because things look a little bit calmer now. April's just come in with the cable, essentially saying, I think this situation's going to wind down. We Americans need to sit tight and not overreact.
The 30,000 troops on Kuwait's border became 100,000, but nothing was done. For 7 days, Arab leaders insisted this was bluff. In London and Washington, politicians used to doing business with Saddam gave him the benefit of the doubt. In Saudi Arabia, on August the 1st, the Iraqis walked out of talks. Saddam issued his orders.